Morning. We are in our last session of this study as well. Finished up Angels Wednesday night a week early. I always forget. Jimmy has told me, I don't know how many times, a quarter does not end, or begin rather, on a Wednesday. But I always forget that. But I already arranged for Brandon Baggett to be here with us for our first summer series this coming Wednesday. So we went ahead and wrapped up our Angels study on Wednesday nights, and now today we will wrap up our Sticks and Stones study. We've talked about the power of words and being careful how we use words, and this last, I don't know, it's been 2 or 3 weeks, we've talked about using words to resolve conflict, and we talked about a better way to talk, staying away from all the hurtful, rude speech and gossip and things like that. Then we talked about a better way to listen, and now we've been talking about a better way to resolve conflict. In geometry, we know a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That is what we call a formula. It will always tell us what we need to know, if we work it properly. We can always use that to obtain information about a right triangle. We know that. All that is just to say that interpersonal relationships are not geometry. There is not a formula that you can always put in and say, if you're ever in a conflict, if you're ever in a disagreement of opinion or even a disagreement of doctrine, plug this formula in, and just like that. It's going to be over and done with because people are different. Every person is unique. There are differing opinions. And even when it comes to doctrine, where there's black and white, right and wrong, sometimes people don't want to follow what's right. And that's just a sad reality. May it never be so with us. We want to be a person, hopefully we want to be a person, we better be a person who wants to follow what is right. And, take the position that when I see what is right, even if it's not what I'm doing or not what I believe, then I'm going to make the necessary changes. But the unfortunate truth is that sometimes you have people where maybe they're in a situation where they're having fun, they're living for the moment, or, sometimes maybe they just haven't seen it yet. Hopefully they will. But anyway, interpersonal relationships are not geometry. So there's not always some kind of magical formula that will work. Almost always when you come through a conflict on the other side, you'll look back and say, I wish I had done this, or I shouldn't have done that. Wish I had said this, wish I had not said that. Even when we're in the right, there have been times when I look back on a conflict and I say, you know what, I still feel like I got treated wrong, I got treated unfairly or something, but I think if I'd handled it differently, maybe that whole thing could have gone more smoothly. That's almost always the case because, again, we're humans and we make mistakes. And even, even when we're in the right, sometimes we can look back and say, well, I could have done it better. And that's living and learning, But there are some helpful principles that we can use that will help us to resolve conflict better. He gives an illustration in this book, a terrible way to resolve conflict. He gives a humorous story, and I've heard it before about the big city lawyer. He's hunting, I think was the way the story went, and he shot something that some kind of a bird, but it landed over on this farmer's property, and so he went over there to get it, and it's in Kentucky as the story goes, and this old Kentucky farmer comes up and says, "What are you doing, mister? You're trespassing. That's my property. That bird belongs to me now." And and he says, "Oh no, and I'm a lawyer. I could take you. I could bleed you dry, and all this stuff." And he says, "Well, around here we just solve things with the 3-kick rule." And he says, "Well, what's that?" And he says, "Well, I kick you 3 times, and then you kick me 3 times, and the first one to relent, then that's the bird belongs to him." And so the young whippersnapper was thinking to himself, "Okay, old man, I'll take you up on this." And he says, "Hey, sounds good to me. He says, I'm going to wear this guy out. And so this old fella comes up and just kicks him hard as he can, and the guy just buckles. And he says, all right, that's one. And so he kicks him again, and the guy, he just knocks the breath out of him, and he's in rough shape. And he says, okay, old man, that's two. You get one more. And so the old man kicks him the third time. He thinks, man, I'm about done for. And so finally he gets his composure, and he says, now it's my turn. And you know what the old man says? That's okay, you can have it. That's a terrible way to resolve conflict, isn't it? But, that's how some people want to resolve it. Everything's got to be a fight, even if it's a verbal fight. That's how some people want to resolve conflict. But there are some helpful principles that help us to find a better way of resolving conflict. One of them is communicate well. So many times, conflict arises because people don't communicate very well. There was a guy when I was in college, one of my best friends, she was from the Birmingham area, and we met because she was a member of the church, and we attended the same congregation there in Tuscaloosa. But I always tell people she was probably my best friend the whole time I was in college. We never dated or anything, but she was just a real good friend of mine. But she was dating this guy at the time, and he now is her husband. But the guy, one of the preachers at the congregation there, he did this class, and it was kind of a marriage and family type class. And he was talking about, and some of the principles in any of these type classes, some of them are not, they don't just sound like something you'd say every day. And so, but he was talking about communication, and especially in relationships, and how people will say something, they talk past each other, or they misunderstand one another. And so he said, a good thing to practice is to stop and say, now, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is, and then repeat it back to him. And so Ashley and her now husband, they would do this, and it was kind of a joke with them. But she told me after about a week of this, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, she said, you know what? You'd be amazed at how much we completely understand the wrong thing that the other person is saying. And it kind of started off as a joke. Now, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is, and she would say something, and then he'd say, actually, no, that's not what I was saying at all. Oh, okay, well, what were you saying? And she said, we started off doing this kind of as a joke, but it's actually solved a lot of problems before they even began, because we just found out we weren't communicating as well as we thought. So learn to communicate well. That could be a whole other study in itself, but obviously we don't have time. But good communication will resolve a lot of conflict before it even begins. Bring specific attitudes to any given conflict. We'll expand on these just a little bit more here in a moment. And, of course, take action. Sometimes you got to take action to resolve conflict. And all that is to say is conflict's not going to resolve itself. It's not just going to magically go away. Again, there are folks that, especially a non-confrontational type person, we want to just pull back from it. We don't want to engage and jump into that conflict. And, sometimes it's like we think, hell, it'll just go away if we leave it alone long enough. But it's not. It's not going to just magically resolve. Now, expanding just a little bit. Communicate well. Listening, understanding, and get it through our heads that listening and understanding is not losing. Some people think if you're not on the offensive in a conflict, then you must be losing ground. And so what happens is you start raising your voice, and then maybe if that person has that same mentality, he or she starts raising his or her voice, and next thing you know, you're in a shouting match. And what's getting resolved in a shouting match? Not a thing. So listening, just taking a step back and saying, okay, tell me what your problem is. Tell me what is the deal here? Why are you so upset? Listening and trying to understand that, and especially to see it from that person's perspective, that's not losing. And too often we feel like it is. We need to learn before we persuade. I put rather than, but sometimes there is certainly a time and a place for persuasion, but first learn. learn where the other person or party is coming from. I may even say, you know what? Before I start persuading, I might realize I'm trying to persuade this person to something that he or she already believes. I see this happen a lot. Sometimes it's an email discussion list of preachers or something, and as a third party, I don't like to get involved on those lists as far as a lot of discussions and stuff, because seems like it generates a lot of conflict. But I'm what they call, some of these people call it a lurker. I just sit there and read, but sometimes you can learn more by just sitting there and reading what the other folks say and kind of working through something in your own mind than trying to engage. But I see these guys, sometimes they'll disagree with one another, and I'm sitting here thinking, as a third party just watching this, these guys, they believe the same on this, and they don't even realize it, because they're so they've gotten themselves into such conflict mode that they don't even realize they're basically saying the same thing. And so sometimes when you learn before you persuade, you may realize, you know what, we already agree on this. There is no conflict. A lot of times when you're in a conflict, you have this giver situation. In other words, I need to give you my perspective, the right perspective, right? And then you have the idea, I need to give you my perspective, which is the right perspective. And so when there's giving going on, then what's not happening at any point? Reception, right? I mean, nobody's receiving if everybody's giving. And so nobody's listening, nobody's understanding, and that has to change. Somebody has to be the mature enough, grown up enough person to say, you know what, I'm going to stop and I'm going to listen. I'm going to receive information and process it and try to work through this conflict. Requires a lot of patience, a lot of flexibility, but it certainly is worth it. Understand first, and then you can worry about persuasion. Oh, and here's another thing. Avoid getting hooked by what some folks call first words. First words. This is big in, I've noticed this. This goes back to my research paper I did several years ago. But I noticed this, thinking about this. It could have a special application in a marriage or some other kind of relationship. But even in the church, here's a good example in the Lord's church of first words. This I know of a situation where this actually happened. Was very close to a situation where this actually happened. There was a fellow who was going to preaching school, and he was looking for support. Needed some from the local congregation. It was his home congregation. And so what they were saying was they were pretty strapped on budget. The elders said, we are really, we pretty much stretched our budget to the max. We're halfway or so through the year. Maybe we could appeal to the congregation or for some help or something, and then when the new year rolls around, we'll look at potentially supporting this fella. And what got stated by some of the family was first words. If that's how it is, we'll be withholding our contribution. We're gonna withhold our contribution and support our relative in preaching school. Those were the, quote, first words. Now, this I've seen it happen with other situations. This is one I just knew about many years ago. But first words. You know what the temptation is if you're an elder or a preacher there, right? To begin to preach. If you're the preacher, well, what needs to happen is I need to get up next Sunday and I need to preach a sermon on giving. And people need to understand that your contribution is for the Lord. It's not for the local church, and it is not to be used as a weapon. And it's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face, and all this. And the elders may begin to, some elders might even get up in a situation like that, and make a special, say something to the congregation, especially if this is a situation where with that fella, he's going to preach a school, and maybe there are several members of the family there that are saying, well, we're going to just withhold our contribution. But I put on here maybe a sermon or 10. But the alternative is search for the deeper meaning. Find out what's really going on there and address that conflict. In that situation that happened that I knew about, what the deeper thing was there is that this fellow's family was hurt. They were proud. Their relative was going to train to become a gospel preacher. He's leaving other occupation, whatever, and so it's kind of a brave new adventure. And they were so proud, and they misunderstood the congregation, the elders saying, well, we can't help right now. They misunderstood that for what? We're not going to help. And that wasn't what they were saying at all. And when the parties got together, and they did in this situation, the family said, we're just hurt that y'all aren't going to help. And the elders said, whoa. We're not going to help. This guy's ours. He grew up here. We're going to make sure he goes. We just can't do it out of the church budget at this time. And so what ended up happening was they talked to the congregation. They put it out there and they said, look, budget is pretty strapped right now, but this fellow's one of ours. I wonder if we couldn't help him get some support. And guess what? He got a lot more than he would have gotten just from the church budget. They would have done 100 or so probably, and he ended up with something like, I think, $300 or $400 a month. So, that's a good example of getting past first words. One time, another example that this was actually in a congregation I preached for. There was a gentleman. It was not too long after 9/11, and so a lot of people were studying Islam at that time, just to try to understand. Number one, why do we, what is the error of Islam? Number two, try to understand some of where they're coming from, and so it just kind of became a popular study at that time. Well, I was preaching at a congregation. I was teaching the teenage class on this particular Sunday, and this other fellow was teaching the auditorium. Well, he was handing out these handouts, and he gets to this one gentleman, and he hands it, and the guy, as soon as he gets to him, he reaches out to hand it to him, and this guy goes, just folded his arm, made a big, ugly, frowny face, and he wasn't taking it. He says, I don't want that. I only study the Bible. And he didn't like it because they were studying Islam instead of studying Christianity and things from the Bible. And well, it kind of got to be a conflict, and those were sort of his first words. Well, once we got a little deeper, we began digging, and we understand what's going on here. There was a much deeper conflict there. In fact, this was a conflict that really went completely unrelated to Bible class at all. But, the point is, people will often say something, those first words, and what we tend to do sometimes is grab them. And we latch on to that, and then we launch into the offensive or defensive, and we haven't really understood the conflict, right? Sometimes there's something much, much deeper. I think it's fair to say quite often, if not even the majority of the time, there's something much deeper there that if we find it and begin to address that, we've already handled a major obstacle. So communicating better. Number two we mentioned was to bring specific attitudes to the conflict. Again, we discussed this just a little bit already, moving into, not away from the conflict. And that seems strange sometimes, but a conflict is never solved by avoidance, and we have to remember that. You're not going to solve it by just avoiding it. What if, in that situation before with the fellow going to preaching school, if the elders decide, you know what, we don't want conflict, things are going pretty well with the work here, we just need to ignore that. Then what happens? You have a whole lot of people withholding contribution. People are talking about it, and maybe in a conversation without not even necessarily trying to be malicious. You have people saying, well, we haven't been giving for months. Well, why are you not giving? Well, my relative so-and-so, he's going to preacher school, and so we're helping him. The elders said they weren't going to help, so we're helping, and now what happens? Little seeds of discord are being planted. The elders aren't helping one of our own go to preaching school, but because the parties got together, sat down, found out the underlying issue, and addressed it, we are going to help this fellow. We just can't do it at the particular moment, and so it gets resolved. You can just see. But if that situation gets ignored, nothing happens to solve it. Yes, sir. Yeah, Abraham and Lot, their herdmen were not getting along, and so Abraham doesn't say, well, I don't want to get into a fight with my nephew, and I'm just going to avoid this. He meets it head on, and he goes to Lot, Genesis 13, and he says, let's not have this conflict. You choose where you want to go, and I'll go the other way. If you go right, I'll go left. You go left, I'll go right. And that's exactly what they did. But that's a good example, perfect example. But you got to move into the conflict. It's not, we view conflict as a, butting heads type thing. It's not always like that. That's when conflict starts getting out of hand. And so don't move into a fight, but move into a resolution of the conflict. Realize the other person sincerely believes he is right. This is especially important when it comes to when we're studying something that is of a doctrinal nature with someone. We get so frustrated sometimes, don't we? Because why does he not believe what I'm saying? And you can present the truth, and it's so clear and so simple. And I sometimes forget that, this person genuinely, I don't deny there are people out there who are rascals, and they are teaching or believing something because it's convenient. Maybe that's what they've always believed, or maybe that's just what mom and dad believe, and they're still living on mom and dad's faith. Or, some people do it for money because they are popular and they get a lot of money. But there are people who genuinely believe, and as the subheading here says, it may be as clear as day to me that this person is wrong, but he doesn't see it, at least not at this particular moment. And the point of all that is, be patient. We a lot of times lose our heads in a conflict because we want the other person to get it so bad that what we do is we just break out a big hammer, metaphorically, and start just smashing. And I mean, we are Hulk smashing with this hammer because we want this person to get it, and we're going to beat this idea into his brain. And guess what? You will never get an idea into someone's head by forcing it. I heard a very, very good illustration one time. I don't even know if there was source was given. If it was, I don't remember. But it's one of the things that's just stuck with me throughout all the years in any kind of a conflict. But it says, ideas can be either seeds or bullets. You can fire an idea like a bullet, and we know what a bullet will do if you get hit, you get struck by a bullet. Your idea can be right, but you fire it like a bullet, and you better be prepared for the fallout. Or it can be a seed, and you plant a seed, and then what? You can water it, you can nurture it, you can fertilize it, but you wait for it to grow. And the better thing to do is to plant seeds, plant ideas, not try to fire them like a bullet or beat them into someone's head, because that just doesn't work. But realize the other person truly believes he or she is right. Withhold or abstain from blaming. It takes at least two for a conflict. It's so easy to say, well, this is your fault. This is his fault. This is her fault. It sounds like dealing with some of my children, talking to some adults. Well, he started it. Well, this is not my fault. He started it. Sometimes this happens with grown-ups. I mean, I've worked secular jobs where I'm sitting here and I'm going, what is going on? I mean, like one time I was at Blue Cross and I'm thinking, I've entered the twilight zone where like my children are at work with me because there was something going on. And I hear these supposedly grown people and they say, well, but she started it. Come on. Be an adult. It takes at least two for conflict. There has to be some kind of a disagreement there, and blaming and throwing blame is just not typically going to help anything. Also, the I'm going to change him attitude is not going to resolve the conflict. That's what so many people do in any conflict, is they want to change the other person. And you can't do that. You can plant ideas, but who's going to change that person? Yeah, he is or she is. You can't change anybody. You can change one person ever for all of time. And that's number one, yourself. And so often in marriage, in work, in the church, we get this "I'm going to change them" attitude. Here's a good attitude to bring to any conflict: lighthearted merriness and a flexible mind. You know that expression, "Blessed are the flexible," for what? They shall not get bent out of shape. And, it's a biblical concept. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, Proverbs 17:22. So a lot of conflict, especially church conflict, it can get downright nasty. And sometimes we just need to keep things light. Now, that's not to say be flippant or be irreverent. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying don't take ourselves so seriously. Sometimes even there might be a time we need to say, you know what, let's just take a step back, and let's maybe if it's a particular meeting or something, might be time to just say, you know what, we need to take a break. We'll come back to this a little bit later. But keep the priorities in check. Don't give in on every single thing. There are times when you're right and you have to stand your ground. But be flexible. Don't get so upset when you're dealing with the conflict that you lose your head. I've seen a lot of conflicts where I saw, in fact, I was just talking to Chris this morning. We were talking about, there was that debate last night and Friday night. But one of the last debates I knew of between a gospel preacher and a denominational preacher was a situation where the brother got so, he was very passionate in defending the truth, but he lost this ability to stay a little bit light and flexible, and he came across to a lot of people as just really attacking the denominational preacher. And several gospel preachers came away from that debate and they said, I feel like he really did a good job with the scriptural aspect of the arguments. He came across as really, really just wanting to beat this guy over the head with the truth, and I think it hurt his effectiveness. So stay lighthearted, not flippant, not irreverent, but lighthearted, and have a flexible mind. And then we talked about taking action. Taking action means not using the past as ammunition. Don't say, well, just like that one time. This happens a lot in marriage if we're not careful. Don't use the past as ammunition. Something that's been forgiven, let it go. Don't attack the other person. We often tend to do this in a conflict. Don't hit someone in their weak spots. We know, especially if we're friends with someone, we know the weak spots. And I've even seen some situations where they're in a conflict completely, 100% unrelated, and a person will say, well, yeah, but remember, just like you, and they'll bring up something completely unrelated. And it's a below-the-belt shot. Because I know you have a weak spot there. Sometimes I get in a situation, I can't answer it, and I'm fighting it, I'm in defensive mode, and so I turn and I hit somebody in the weak spot. That is absolutely unacceptable, and we got to bring a mindset that we're not going to do that into a conflict. Stick to the facts. Don't, watch out for exaggeration. Don't be a person who says, well, you always, whatever. You never do this. I doubt either of those statements are ever 100% true. Deal with conflict promptly. Watch out for a pressure cooker situation, because that will make it way worse. Create common goals to work toward together. And again, this is something that's easy in the church because Jesus has given us these goals. You don't have to sit here and find, okay, what common goals could we work toward together? Well, Jesus has told us we're to be unified. We're to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And so we better resolve conflicts because we're working toward those goals. And we've got common goals if we're faithful to the Lord that we can work toward. Elders want to be sure to communicate other goals. Also, there may be congregational goals. And so those are things we can work toward together. And then there's the GRIT method, gradual reduction in tension. Example is the former Soviet Union. You can gradually change someone's perception. A lot of A lot of you can remember, I was just probably junior high age when the wall came down, the Berlin Wall, which was kind of a symbol of communism falling. But a lot of you can probably remember, what was the senator, a communist under every Bush, McCarthy? Was that his name? A lot of you can remember, it was just synonymous with enemy. When you think Soviets, USSR, the Soviet Union, it was just synonymous with, this is a very real threat, and they are out to get us. We studied it in history, Khrushchev with his boot, and we're going to crush you and all this kind of thing. But you think about the gradual reduction in tension that the former Soviet Union was able to accomplish. It requires unilateral movement from one party. In other words, you're going to have to be the big person. You're going to have to be the mature one who says, you know what, if I make a move toward reconciliation and I get slapped in the face for it, I'm not going to say, all right, that's it. And now the gloves are coming off and I'm going to fight back. You've got to be willing to, if they slap you in the face, you turn the other cheek. You can't have a what's in it for me mentality, at least not in the short run. But it requires patience, especially when you don't feel like being nice. But the Soviet Union, they did this, and that is, now they're an ally. And even before the wall fell, they reduced that tension gradually by making unilateral movements toward other nations. And then the last action here is to understand and work through the process for resolving interpersonal conflict. I wish we had more time to talk about this. There's a process that we tend to go through. Sometimes we start off trying to change the other person. Again, you can't do that. You cannot change someone else. Then sometimes we start changing ourselves to try to change someone else. And again, it's all with trying to change someone else. And you just can't do that. Sometimes we change self to meet our own goals, which may work for a time. Then sometimes we come to a point where we have to accept another person as he is. That doesn't mean we condone it, but it means understanding I can't forcibly change you. And then, the last resort is to leave the situation. And in a church situation, if it's something that's a matter of opinion, it may mean that I just place membership elsewhere, but you want to make sure you leave and resolve the conflict and leave on good terms. And in a doctrinal matter or something that violates Scripture, that may mean a situation where the elders have to take action and withdraw fellowship. But that is always, a last resort. The worst conflict, some of this we've talked about already, but church conflict can be the worst. I think I've mentioned this one before as well. The fellow that got stranded on a desert island, and a boat came and rescued him, and there were 3 little huts there, and he's talking to this captain of the boat that has rescued him, and he says, well, that little hut over there is where I lived. I built that by my bare hands. I've been stranded on this island for so many years, and that was my house. And he said, well, what about that one in the middle? And he says, well, that's where that's my church. I go to church there. It's where I worship. And he says, oh, okay, well, what about the one on the far left here? And he says, well, that's where I used to go to church. Church conflict can be the worst. Sometimes even just by yourself, you still have conflict. It may hurt to admit this, but we do need to acknowledge that as Christians, we often do a very lousy job of getting along. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because sometimes we feel like all bets are off, the rules are out the window because there's maybe not necessarily as much accountability. But sometimes we can do a very lousy job of fulfilling passages like, loving one another as Christ has loved us, John 13, 34, and 35. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love one to another. John 15, same concept. See that you love one another with a pure heart fervently, 1 Peter 1, 22. Love your brethren, 1 John 3, 23, 4, 21. There's a lot of other passages. I had to whittle that down a little bit for time's sake, but, we don't always do the best job of this. Jesus prayed for unity, John 17, 20, and 21, that they all may be one. In Romans 12, 18, the idea there is much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. I think that's right. I didn't write that one down. Make sure I got that right. Romans 12:18. But we don't always do the best job of this, and it's something that, yes, that's it. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. And that's not, sometimes that may be everybody's fault. Sometimes that may be one party's fault or another. But it's something that I think we need to acknowledge, and we can work on it when we acknowledge that. There's a lot that goes into as far as why that is, and we just don't have time to cover all that. But it is a fact, and we need to do a better job with it. We need to realize souls are dying lost every day, every minute, every hour. That ought to be a very powerful incentive for all of us to work out conflict, not just go along to get along, but to resolve the conflict. Also, if you've been hurt by church conflict, sometimes people will say, well, I was faithful, and then there was this falling out at church, and I just don't go to church anymore. It really soured me on church. So wait a minute. There was a conflict, and some people acted ugly, and so you decided you'd punish Jesus Christ for that? Folks, don't take your frustration, your hurt, out on the Lord. Don't take it out on His body, the church. There may be everybody in the single congregation acting like fools, acting like a bunch of ungodly people. It doesn't change the fact the Bible is right, and Jesus died on the cross for our sins. So whatever goes wrong in a congregation, whatever may go wrong, understand there's a human side of the church, and it's flawed, and it makes, humans make mistakes. But there's also a divine side, and Jesus is perfect. And so you can't go to heaven outside of Jesus Christ. You can't go to heaven outside the body of Christ. So I tell people, if people are acting crazy and not acting Christ-like in one location, find somewhere where they are. But don't quit the church, because you can't go to heaven like that. And so if you think it's bad having to be with them on a Sunday morning if they're acting like heathens, then imagine an eternity in hell with that kind of person, because that's where quitting the church will end you up. The solution to church conflict is to have the mind of Christ, Philippians 2, to be a servant like Jesus Christ. That is the solution to conflict. Let me pull this up very quickly. I know we're running out of time here, or out of time. This is all from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. Be a peacemaker, not a peace breaker. Control your emotions. Control your emotions. That is very, very important. Remaining calm when others are not, that's a virtue. Anger will cause you, one fellow said, to think what should never be thought, say what should never be said, and do what should never be done. Very true. Speak when you're angry, and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret. Isn't that the truth? So control your emotions, be a peacemaker, avoid name calling. It's very immature. Plus, Jesus talks about that in Matthew 5:22 about calling your brother Raka or fool. Make peace quickly. Be accurate. Avoid exaggeration. We talked about that already. Resist the urge to retaliate. Stay on the high road. Talk to God about it. Be eager to forgive. Don't hold a grudge, in other words. Be what you want others to be. Again, you can change only one person. Get the plank out of your own eye first. Practice the golden rule. That's what Jesus talks about there in Matthew 7:12. We're all familiar with the golden rule. All things, therefore, whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do you even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And then this is my last slide. I'll just bring it up here. Quite possibly the most neglected command of Jesus is Matthew 18:15. Now this is dealing with sin, private sin, not a public sin. But it means we need to go to a person, speak in such a way that will restore the soul, restore the relationship if possible. It means we must not go and tell other people about it until we've gone to the person. It means we must not broadcast a person's faults when it's a private sin. And it means we cannot and must not sit there and hold a grudge. I hope this is helpful as far as talking about a better way to resolve conflict. We don't always do the best job of that, and I think maybe it's just because sometimes we don't talk about the better way for resolving conflict. I've enjoyed this study very much. I think I've learned a lot from it. It's been very humbling for me to think about some of these things and work to do better. Thank you so much for your attention. That'll be our last class of this quarter, and Lord willing, next Sunday we begin our new quarter. It's hard to believe it's already June. Time's flying. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before worship.